Hello coders, today we're going to be talking about compassionate software development. I'm joined by Ash Furrow from New York. Ash is a software developer, author, open source contributor, and volunteer at some coding clubs. We're going to be talking about all of that and more. Welcome to the show, Ash. How are you doing? Have you had a good week?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. My week is, it's almost over, so it's going pretty good.
Awesome. Yeah, it's always good to do it on a Friday. So let's start by talking about your background. What kind of software do you build?
Right. So my background has traditionally been in iOS software development, but lately I kind of do everything. I really enjoy taking a problem and trying to solve it with whatever technology I have at my disposal that I can use to solve the problem. So I don't want to limit myself to only solving the kinds of problems that can be solved with iOS software. Mm-hmm. So at my job at Artsy, I've been working in everything from Scala to Rails backends to React front ends. Nowadays, you can find me kind of digging around the internals of our React Native application so that I can support our web developers coming over to be productive. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really enjoy doing nowadays is helping my colleagues be productive.
That's brilliant. And how long have you been doing this for?
I've been doing iOS development since 2009, but that was still in university. So I've only been full-time professional software engineer since 2011.
2011. Still, that's quite a fair stint. And how did you get into this industry?
Yeah. So I started, like I said, I went to university. I studied computer science, and I got really involved in the community there. I was I was actually on the student union, so I was the computer science faculty representative, and I took that very seriously. So I would organize things like lecture series and bringing in, software engineers from the local community in the city that we were in to give talks to the students or to my fellow students. And, it sort of started out from there. After I got involved in iOS software development, I started blogging about it. And that sort of launched the writing aspect of my career, and more generally speaking, the knowledge sharing aspects of my career.
Yes, because you've created some books yourself, haven't you? You've got a number of books that you've written. We'll talk about those in more detail in just a second. Let's just focus though first on your university sort of background, because was it a software course that you were doing at university?
It was technically a Bachelor of Computer Science. It's one of the only universities in Canada that still prints out its degrees in Latin. So I don't know what it is in Latin off the top of my head, but wow. So I have a strong foundation in the theory of computation. I did a minor in mathematics, but that's sort of the academic side. Mm-hmm. A lot of my courses were spent in things like psychology classes, economics, music theory. I really tried to take advantage of the universal aspect of university and become a more rounded person, and that has more than anything benefited me as a professional.
Excellent. And what was the thing that drove you to do that course?
Well, that's a good question. I knew computers, something about them was just magical. When I was in high school, I didn't have a home internet connection, but we had an old computer. So I would print off JavaScript tutorials and then take them home and put them into the Internet Explorer so I could run local JavaScript. And that's how I learned computer programming. And I was just so taken away by the idea of I can have an idea and I can put it into something that works, and I can create, but it's not real. It's not physical, but it's still tangible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get that. It sounds like you've done a lot of stuff with other people, in the sense that you've helped mentor, or you've helped other people get involved, especially from even the university level, where you were helping people. You mentioned speak and get involved. Is that threaded throughout your development career, do you think?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, that also ties into what I was saying about how I enjoy helping my colleagues be productive.
Yeah.
I really help, or I really enjoy helping others. I get a lot of satisfaction out of that. So one of the biggest contributions I make to the New York tech scene, I guess you'd call it, is Peer Labs. Peer Labs were started by my friend Samuel in Amsterdam.
Right.
And when I was living there, I would spend every Saturday morning going to this cafe and just working with other people and just being in the same space as other software developers. And if I had a question, I could just ask around, and if I heard a question that was interesting to me, I could offer my perspective.
Okay.
So when I moved to New York 4 years ago, I immediately started one of these peer labs. I knew it was such a great idea, so I do it at the Artsy office every Saturday morning. That helps us keep the attendance from exploding too much because we don't have a ton of space. Artsy buys us pizza every weekend and provides the Wi-Fi and coffee, and that's more than enough. So we have between like 20 and 30 people show up every Saturday morning from 10:30 to 1 just to work together. And it's strange because like I don't do a lot. Like it's not a typical meetup where there are presentations. It's a meetup where you go to learn, but it's not a place you go to be taught, if that makes sense.
So it's not necessarily like a user group in the sense that we have like lightning talks or a particular theme.
That's right.
Is it correct to say it's more like a co-working space? Is that
yeah
correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very fair to compare it to that. And it started out very focused in iOS development, but over the years it has spread. I created a website called peerlab.community a couple of years ago because I knew this was a really good idea and I wanted to spread it. Mm-hmm. So peerlab.community has instructions for someone to start their own peer lab, and it has a list of peer labs around the world. So there are peer labs in many different continents, many cities. People have taken this idea and created something on their own, and that's the sort of like that level is what I'm really interested in. Like when I can take an idea that I have and implement it, that's great. But if I can make that an idea that helps other people, like that's what I'm really interested in out of my career.
That is super awesome.
Thanks.
So how does one say if there was a listener in New York, how does one join? How does one start to go to one of these things?
Yeah. So if you wanted to go to the peer lab that I help run, you would go to peerlab.community, find it there in the list. There's a link to the meetup page. Mm-hmm. There's also like contact details if you have any questions or just want to like find out more first.
Right.
Yeah.
And does it cost anything? Is there a subscription? Is there
No, it's just a purely free volunteer run thing. Like I said, Artsy provides the space, the Wi-Fi, pizza, the coffee. My coworker and I run it. We're there every week. I've found that it's helpful to have someone help you out with these things in case I wake up sick one day. I don't have to worry about people showing up to the office and building security wouldn't let them in, be a whole thing. So we avoid that, but yeah, it's something that I do because I think it's important for people to have a space where they can work. A lot of the meetups are focused around teaching, and I think that's really important. But they're focused on sort of like distribution of knowledge from a leader to people who are learners, and it has a strong networking component. Whereas this really focuses on like just the work. Like we did start. So one of the really cool things is that some of the other Peer Lab organizers have visited New York, and they've visited my Peer Lab, and we exchange ideas. And they have taken this idea that I got from Samuel, and they've improved upon it. So now we start off with a stand-up. We actually go around and introduce ourselves and say what we're working on, and that kind of gives you an opportunity to talk about yourselves via, what you're interested in doing, what you are doing, rather than necessarily like who you are already.
That is so cool. That is so cool. I must say, I wasn't even aware of this. This is such a. I wish. It's another. When I speak to people who have these amazing ideas and they contribute, I wish I knew of these things when I was first starting out. So for anyone who didn't catch that, what is the URL that they need to go to?
They should go to peerlab.community.
Peerlab.community. I'll put all of these links in the show notes below. You also volunteer at a place called Coalition for Queens. Is that correct?
Yep, Coalition for Queens. They're rebranding as Pursuit, but they are you can think of them like a hacker school or a boot camp, but they're a nonprofit. So they bring in people from underrepresented groups in tech, from mainly from the Queens borough of New York, and they teach them how to code. It's a very intensive process. It takes about 9 months, and they cover everything from the first time you may have opened the terminal to shipping something to the store. If you're doing the iOS curriculum, and then a large component of that is building a final project to show off to employers and preparation for interviews. And I help out with the iOS curriculum, so helping just figure out what it is that the employers are going to be asking for, and helping, because we only have so much time, we need to deliver that curriculum to them as quickly as possible. A lot of the people are working full-time jobs while they're going to this in the nights and weekends. It's a huge amount of work, and I have nothing but respect for the students there. And the other way I help is by just being there for different events. If they have a hackathon, I'll be there to help mentor the different groups. Or a big component of this is mock interviews. So getting them in the practice of interviewing for a job before they really have a lot of stakes, and giving them the feedback that they need to be successful in an interview afterwards. And unfortunately, a large part of that involves whiteboard interviewing, which I'm personally very much against. But this is something that it's weird because I'm against it, but I have to help them prepare for it. So I have to be a whiteboard interviewer.
That's cool. That initiative is so awesome. Is it open for anyone who wants to start learning these things, or do they only target a particular type of developer, front end, back end, junior?
Right. So they have 3 different sort of streams you can go in. There is iOS, Android, and web.
Right.
So web covers a bit of Rails and front end as well. And yeah, it's great. They put a lot of their educational materials up on GitHub, so they're big believers in sharing knowledge as well. So we align very well that way.
And you said that they are a non-profit as well. That is awesome. Yeah, wow. Kudos to them. And if anybody wants to find out more information about Coalition for Queens, what is the URL?
The best way to get to them would be c4q.nyc, and that should that if they have their new website up by the time this comes out, it'll redirect to their new site.
Sweet, that's great. Thank you ever so much. That's I hope that will help people out who listen to the podcast. I get asked all the time about resources, and what would I advise people to do if they're trying to get into this industry? Maybe they've got problems with financing a course, or just don't have the confidence to go to a full-blown sort of user group with a talk and be taught at, like you said. But those 2 things, Peer Lab, Coalition for Queens, that I think they would help fit that space. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, we actually get a lot of students coming from C4Q to come to the Peer Lab as well. People, most Peer Labs will have half of them regulars, and half of them will be people who just show up every now and then, or maybe newcomers. And it's a great mix to have seasoned professionals coming in alongside people who may have only started programming a few months ago.
It gives them a level of exposure to other developers in a comfortable space. That is super cool. Yeah, I'm really digging that. Okay, so you yourself have written several books. Let's talk about those for a minute. How many books have you created?
That's a good question. I think 5. But one of them, like my first book, I got noticed by an author and his publisher, and he was looking for. It was a book on Objective-C, and he wanted someone to write the boring chapters that, the sort of like chapters 1 through 5 of just getting someone familiar with the basics so that he could focus on the interesting stuff. And that's how I got involved in book writing. After that, I wrote a book on UICollectionView, which is at the time it was a new way to build user interfaces in iOS applications. After that, I started self-publishing. I wrote a book on your first Swift app. I wrote a book on functional reactive programming, and those have been through a few different editions. Most recently, I don't write as much as I used to, but I do a lot of technical editing.
Right.
My most recent project is with the RayWenderlich.com site on RX Swift, which is also on functional reactive programming.
Right. And if anybody wanted to find out what the books are and see if they can order one, where is the best place to do that? Are they on Amazon?
Yeah, a lot of them are on Amazon.
Yeah.
I've got links to all of them from my books page, so you can go to ashfurrow.com/books and you can look at them all there.
Awesome. I will put that in the show notes as well.
Thanks.
That sounds good. So, just talking about the books, what was your motivation to actually start writing? What was the thing that drove you to that?
Well, I mean, I started writing on my blog a lot, way before I started writing books. And my motivation for that was just to understand things better, because I find that I did a lot of TA work when I was in university, and the nights I spent in the labs helping other students with their homework, I mean, maybe it was a class I had already done before, or maybe it was a student in the same class that I was in, but teaching solidified concepts for me in a way that strictly classroom learning or even application of like doing homework assignments didn't help me with. I really by going through the process of teaching someone else something, I really had to understand my stuff. So I applied that to what I was learning. There was no course at my university on how to build iOS applications because this was 2009. But I wanted to take that same idea. So I started blogging about everything from how do you use an array in Objective-C and really basic stuff. And, a lot of those blog posts are still up. So I loved the idea of exploring a topic, and I've always really enjoyed writing. I was really fortunate to have a fantastic English teacher in high school who gave me a love of expressing ideas, and it just kind of combines a couple of the things that I enjoy so much, which is helping others. It's expressing myself, and really, it's fun to sort of put your mind through the pace of the paces of how do I explain this idea? Because it's not enough to understand. You really have to be good at taking a complex idea, breaking it down into simple terms, and then delivering those simple terms in a way that resonates with an audience. And that's those are skills that I apply outside just writing books or blog posts. At work, I have a weekly office hours for people just to come and work on writing assignments. If they're trying to write a blog post, or if they're applying to speak at a conference, or if they're just writing some documentation or something that they care about. It's such a rewarding thing for me to do. I enjoy it so much.
Well, I'm certainly getting some compassionate vibes from you. You're very switched on with how the other developers, your peers, the people you're around, feel about the software that they're writing, and it sounds like you've set up some spaces that make them feel as comfortable and as welcome as possible. And I think here's a great point part to sort of talk about the compassion of software. How do you think compassionate software development should be? I mean, what's your thoughts on that? What's your take on compassionate software? What is it from your perspective?
Right. Yeah. So compassionate software is a way of building software compassionately, and that's sort of circular. So what does that even mean?
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to define compassion in terms that programmers understand. So I look at compassion as an optimization problem. So it's something that I'm trying to minimize. I'm trying to minimize suffering. And when I approach compassion in those terms, it becomes easy to see, like, if I'm considering taking an action, I can think about how that action is going to affect the amount of suffering around me. So that will help drive, like that really motivates my underlying philosophy to how I approach software development. And that's sort of like the philosophical side of things. On the practical side of things, I think that I lay this out in a blog post linked to from the homepage of my website. But to build compassionate software, you really have to recognize that feelings matter, and that's not always something that people take for granted, that programmers take for granted. But it's true. Feelings do matter, whether or not you're willing to acknowledge that they still influence us. And one thing that I really have focused, I've been fortunate because Artsy has given me the space and the resources to do some research and not only bring these ideas back to our team, but also share them with other teams. But one thing that I kept coming back to was psychological safety. And unfortunately, this has become a bit of a buzzword. But psychological safety is, a way to describe how willing your team members are to take interpersonal risks. So that could be asking a question they think everyone already knows the answer to. That could be, suggesting a unconventional idea. The degree of psychological safety that your team exhibits can really have a huge impact on how your team performs. Teams that exhibit psychological safety perform better, and we actually have data on this. Right. We can look at psychological safety in hospital teams, which is actually where a lot of the academic research has been done, and we see that surgeries where people discuss their mistakes, or surgical teams where the professionals, the nurses and the doctors, they discuss their mistakes and they're upfront with them, they actually have better post-operation patient outcomes than the teams that report fewer mistakes. They're still making mistakes, but they're not reporting them and they're not learning from them. And so, this is you've hit like the sort of central driving force behind my professional practice, but psychological safety is a huge component of that. And to build compassionate software, you really have to think about your team in terms of psychological safety and in terms of minimizing the suffering of those around you.
Wow, I've never thought of it like that at all. We are all human, and yet we are writing code to build systems, and I've never thought of the having that sort of level of thought about the feelings of others. I mean, I try and obviously go about my day to day in a respectful manner, sure, but that's really from a sort of high level sort of point of view. That's quite an interesting topic.
And like just to touch on, or to branch off something that you touched on there, the idea of like building systems. I think you're absolutely right. Like, we build systems, but we actually write code. And there's this idea that we write code for computers, and I disagree with that. If you've read the book, The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs,
I haven't, no. Who wrote that?
It was sort of a few different, I can't remember their names right now, but a group of people wrote this book. few decades ago, I believe. It was quite, foundational to me at the time. I haven't read it in a long time. But the idea is that we don't write code for computers. We write it for people, and it's only incidentally executed by computers. And they state that in introduction of the book. It's sort of like so foundational to their work as well.
Wow, that's just blown my mind. Yep. Wow. After this show, do send me that link, because I will look at getting that book, and it sounds like it's going to be an eye-opening read. And I can only say that I wish I was exposed to this when I was at university, because we were always taught, to build software for software's sake, in the sense that you have a client and this is their needs, and so you're going to build the software to fulfill that client's needs, but you never took upon the emotional implications of what that software could do, if it's going to make the person more happy, more sad, and also just the general soft skills around talking to the client, talking to and discovering the customer's needs. It was, we came away, what I'm trying to sort of say in a roundabout way is we came away with a to-do list of things to build, and we weren't actually given the impact level of what those things could do. And it's also, I think, around the bugs and the priorities. So, I mean, when you're fixing bugs, you gravitate to the low-hanging fruit, which isn't always the best to go for, because there are bugs that perhaps would benefit the person's life more than make them feel more comfortable. It's not just solving an issue because the software's broken. It's also solving an issue because this is actually impacting someone's life. And that's a very interesting. My mind is now going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just the software we build for the intention that we build it. I mean, we can build software that is misused, or we could build software that breaks in an unexpected way.
Ooh,
and I think as professionals, we have a responsibility to think about those sort of things when we build something. How might it be used, or what would be the implications of this breaking? I think those are important questions to ask.
Yeah, that's such a good point. The whole misuse of software. Yeah, I think that's something that we don't, as developers, consider enough. How might this software be used for bad, for evil?
Yeah, this is to get off on a little bit of a tangent. This is something that I've been thinking about more recently, because where I'm from in Canada, I'm not allowed to call myself a software engineer because I don't have a software engineering degree. I'm not a member of the Professional Engineering Society. So that's a protected term. If I called myself that without that accreditation, that would be against the law. And when I come to the U.S., it's very different, where I am a software engineer, and I'm not. There was a time when I was very much against that idea, but language changes over time. So I'm not against the idea of calling myself a software engineer now. What I try to do instead is learn more about engineering and what does it mean to engineer something that is, building something and engineering something are two different activities, and what makes them different. What's the delta between those two, and how can I learn how to engineer something so that I can build something better?
Am I right in thinking, because you touched on the point there about engineers, am I right in thinking, and this might be just a stupid question, but am I right in thinking that over in the US, I'm not too sure where, but when you're classed as an engineer of building, say you're building a bridge, you have to take an engineer's oath to say that you're going to build this responsibly, ethically. Is that the case?
In Canada, it is. I'm not sure about the US, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's So I mean, we don't. I mean, even doctors and nurses, when they have to take an oath. They have to take an oath to, and we don't. We, as software developers, we don't. And there's been all sorts of things in the industry where something has been in the news. I'm not going to name any names. And, as a developer, it's kind of shocked me. It's sort of like, how could you have done this? And that those developers are just going to get hired again, and we don't have any of that. We don't have any of that sort of, I don't want to call it a safety net, but we don't have that kind of, that regulation.
And I think there's a reluctance to adopt any sort of regulation because software development has always been seen as a sort of a scrappy endeavor, something that you can do in your hobby that you can turn into a business in your garage. And there's the whole Silicon Valley mythos that's sort of wrapped up in this. And I don't think it's an either or kind of thing. I think that we can look to engineering to take the best ideas of engineering and the best ideas of protecting people when we build something and apply those without bringing on all of the, it's trade-offs. There's always going to be a trade-off. And I don't think that by rejecting the decision, we really do a service to the idea of like trading things off. And we do that all the time when we write code. We make trade-offs. Are we going to use this library, or whatever, but we don't sometimes approach, the practice of building software in the same sort of nuanced way.
Yeah. That's such a good point. Yeah. So let's say, for example, someone wants to get into this industry and they want to be compassionate. Is there any sort of advice that you could give as to how they should conduct themselves, how they should go about their business, how they should develop the software? What are the things that they need to consider?
That's such a good question. I've never really thought about it from the perspective of a true beginner. Mostly when I give talks or when I write blog posts about this kind of thing, I'm targeting people who are experienced professionals, or maybe they, at the very least, they're already working in the industry. I think that, I can recommend some resources. Compassionate Coding is a firm run by April Wenzel, and she has a lot of great resources around like the importance of compassion. And she goes into a lot more of the practical details than I do. And I have a lot of respect for her and her work. But I think it's also just worth mentioning that like it's not going to be the default. When you enter the software industry, it isn't going to be the case that everyone is compassionate, or that more people than not are compassionate. You're going to run into situations where people aren't acting in this sort of like the way that I've expressed. Even around New York, there are companies I know about that I don't have interest in working with professionally because of how they act, and unfortunately that's pretty common. So if what I've talked about has resonated with you, and you're interested in applying compassion to your practice of building software, definitely do that. Please do pursue that and keep that interest alive. But, when you're first beginning out, the most important things for you to focus on are going to be your skills and practicing your skills. So there's going to be a balance, again, with trade-offs. You're going to have to balance between gaining the skills and experience that you need to demonstrate that you're someone worth hiring in this job market, but you're also going to have to try to be true to yourself and true to your ideals. So try to be upfront about those things, and don't turn away from difficult or don't turn away from difficult topics of discussion or ideas. Yeah,
that's some very good points there. I guess as someone who could be looking to get into this industry, it is important, as you said, to focus on the skills. These compassionate things will crop up, and I can count several occasions in my career where I have thought hang on a minute, this isn't actually the best direction. It doesn't sort of sit right. It's not comfortable with me in some of the companies that have approached me for doing various things. It could be an ethical thing. It could be how they treat. It could even be how they treat data. It's and you have to navigate those waters. And you shouldn't just chase the check. You shouldn't just chase the high end price if they're just sort of waving this sort of paycheck around. You have to navigate your way around what is it that you're actually going to be doing, how are you going to be influencing the end user, and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I can think of privacy, ethical, all sorts of random stuff that you have to consider when you are more senior, because you're exposed more to all of these opportunities, and not every opportunity is the right opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I've targeted so many of my resources at people who are, I would say, like intermediate to senior, because as the leaders in the industry, they're the ones who have the most sway, and they're the ones who sort of set the rules, set the range of acceptable behavior. So they're the ones who I sort of target with this. And I think that if I were to sort of like sum up for a beginner who wants to get involved, try not to worry about this too much now, but keep it in mind. And as you grow in your career, return to this idea and refine your practice over time.
That's, very good point. Very, very good point. So we've talked about compassionate software development, and we've also talked about the various bits and pieces that you do. You sound like you're an extremely busy guy. You also do contribute to open source software. Are you able to talk about some of those projects that you've worked on?
I'd love to, yeah. The biggest project that I've sort of like built that's become like an open source project is called Moya, MOYA, and it's a networking library for iOS. It was built. It was started in the weeks after Swift's announcement in 2014, and it became its own GitHub community and organization for people to contribute to. I've kind of like stepped back as a leader from that, but I'm not. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, Moya is a very technically interesting library, and its use of some new Swift language features was really innovative at the time. But what I'm most proud of in that project is the community that I built up. One of the biggest keys to success that Moya saw was that whenever someone submitted a pull request and we merged it, we would invite them to the GitHub organization so that they could review other pull requests and they could help triage bugs. They had full right access to the repo. We protected the master branch. We did, basic due diligence and everything. And this sort of became what we called the Moya contributor guidelines that we now promote on the Moya GitHub organization. We have fully automated this process. So now whenever a PR gets merged and the person's not already in the GitHub organization, they are invited and comments left on their pull request explaining what's going on, linking to our code of conduct, and asking them to reach out with any questions. So that's been the most successful part of my open source contributions. I would say I do something similar with the RX Swift community GitHub organization. RX Swift is like a way to build applications in a paradigm called functional reactive programming. Right. And the RX Swift community GitHub org is all about extending RX Swift to fit in with iOS in a more first-class way. So whereas RX Swift provides the abstractions you need to build software, RX Swift community might provide the access to the Bluetooth API using the RX Swift abstractions, or it might provide, these sort of like iOS specific things, whereas RX Swift is really a shared abstraction that you can find, RX Java, RX PHP, like a whole bunch of languages implement RX. And that's been great because it hasn't really been like, a lot of the earlier projects were things that I created, but over time, we've got dozens of projects now from different people who they had a need and they solved that need with some code and they shared it with others. And now they're a part of a community of people who all believe that, this is a cool way to write programs and they want to share what they learn with each other. Mm-hmm. So those are like the two biggest like open source contributions I made, but my work is largely open source. Artsy is it's not unique among engineering companies, but it is fairly distinct, which is to say that we practice what's called open source by default. Right. Most software is written sort of like a closed source by default. So you close the source, you keep it secret unless there's a reason to open it up and share it. And we kind of turn that on its head and we say, well, wait a minute, why don't we share it unless there's a reason to keep it secret? And through that process, when I joined Artsy, we had a lot of open source, but since then, all of our iOS software, every app that we've written, so we've got 4 or 5 iOS applications, depending how you count. They're all open source. We make it really easy for contributors to download the source code and play with it and learn from it. And we do that on our front end web stack as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of the software that Artsy builds is open source, but not all of it. We're not like ideologues or anything. There's practical reasons to keep something closed.
Of course, yes.
But that's a huge source of pride for me is that, I can use the software that I build at Artsy for other things, I wanted to, know how fast computers were at building Xcode projects. So I used one of our open source iOS applications and I started a GitHub repo called Xcode Hardware Performance. And people have just been submitting the times that it takes to build this software with clean compiles and incremental builds in Xcode for the past 3 years or so. And we have like a huge list of like, if you're looking to buy a Mac and you're curious, like, what is the difference between, buying a MacBook Air and buying like a beefed out MacBook Pro? Like, what does that mean in terms of my day to day? And you can see that like, the compile times are like a third as long. So, that resource wouldn't have been possible without first having, a production complex iOS application to use as a testbed.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds awesome. I love the fact that the majority of things are open source. I think that is probably one of the only companies that I'm aware of at the moment that has that kind of stance. My background, just to give a bit of context, is e-commerce, where they dare not put things in the open source world. Well, at least their base stuff. Obviously, they use lots of other libraries and bits and pieces. How have you? What you say that there's some sensitive stuff, obviously, that you keep closed. Mm-hmm. What's your take on the copyright of things like that? Are you? I guess because of the contributors, it's slightly easier because the people are actually helping you build the thing. But what was the stance with things like duplicating and forking the project? Is that still possible?
Oh yeah, definitely. All of the open source we have is distributed under the MIT open source license, so it's a permissive license. Someone can, they could, if they wanted to, build like a competitor to Artsy's application, but they'd be using our API. Like the software isn't really the valuable part of our business, and that's how we determine whether or not something should be closed or not. If the software makes us unique and valuable, then we keep it closed source. So our API is closed source, but the GraphQL server that orchestrates all of our front end requests and calls our API, that's open source because it's not, nothing about a GraphQL orchestration layer is helping, Artsy be unique. It's really a tool that we use to provide a service to our users and to our customers. And so, we've had open source libraries that we've created and open sourced. We encourage our engineers when they create a library, they create it under their own GitHub user. They have the copyright to it. We just ask that the MIT license it so that Artsy can continue to use it. We've had competitors open up pull requests to our open source libraries because they used it and they wanted to improve it. So it's not like a zero sum game. We have there's an opportunity to see software and building software as a way to improve the world outside just improving, your product. So, I exactly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's such a unique and refreshing stance on developing software. Mm-hmm. Especially the point you made about the competitors have made pull requests, because they would be doing a pull request knowing that they are themselves making their competitors' software better.
Mm-hmm. But remember, they've already made the software better. They're just sharing that improvement with us. And that's sort of a way for them to reciprocate, because they couldn't have made the improvement on the software without us distributing that software in the first place.
Yeah, I see. That's wow. You've blown my mind a couple of times. That's really, really good. How did you get involved with that company?
I was so it was late 2013, and my wife was finishing her grad school, and we were like, well, let's live outside of North America for a little bit. We weren't really, we wanted to live in a different country. We weren't really excited about America. We eventually ended up in New York, but we decided to move to Amsterdam because it had a really cool community there of app developers called Appsterdam, and that's where I found out about PureLab and everything. So we moved there. The job that I had found remotely kind of fell through, and so I was just doing some contracting and stuff. And there was a conference in Amsterdam that I was speaking at, that an acquaintance of mine from Twitter named Orthothorox, he was speaking at as well. The CocoaPods dependency manager is a project that he's involved with, and we did some pair programming on this dependency manager over the weekend that the conference took place, and we just worked together and worked really well together. So he said if I was ever looking for a job, that I should send him a direct message on Twitter. So that's what I did, and that's how I ended up at Artsy.
Wow, that's a great story. It's been fascinating talking to you and discovering all the compassionate side of software. I do please send me that book link. I will get it and I'll read it. And I think that this is why I love doing these things, because I take away a lot of stuff. Speaking to very interesting people like yourself. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you wish to add? Do you have any social media links that you would like to mention, or anything else that you want to plug?
Sure, yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Ash Furrow, ASHFURROW. I've got a website, ashfurrow.com. I host a Mastodon instance if you're trying to get away from the the sort of centralized aspects of social media. You can go to mastodon.technology and sign up for an account. Follow me there. That's it.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely put all those in the show notes, both on the YouTube and on the podcast. It's been fantastic. It's been fascinating talking to you, Ash. I wish you all the best in whatever you build in the future. And thank you ever so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching or listening on the podcast. Happy coding, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.